Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start today with something which at least I find positive and which is getting far too little play here in the United States. I'll come back to talk to you about it a little bit later. This has to do with the events yesterday across Europe. Something happened there that is historic and that deserves your appreciation. In virtually every country of Europe, simultaneously, by planned arrangement, yesterday, the 29th of September, trade unions, teachers groups, student groups, church groups, socialist parties, communist party, those institutions, those latter ones are more important in Europe than they are here, organized and mobilized huge demonstrations. 100,000 people in Brussels, the head of the center of the European government at this time. In the country of Spain, there was a complete general strike and shutdown involving millions of workers. There were major demonstrations in Ireland, which is a very interesting phenomena, and that is new, the level of militancy in Ireland. The Polish trade union Solidarity, that you may remember from the role it played many years ago in the changes in Poland, it was out today. Yesterday, but in a different sense, namely it was participating with all the other trade unions in these demonstrations. Millions and millions of people in a coordinated way. Trade union federations that often do not see eye to eye or work together did. They built unified coalitions with all kinds of other social groups around one central idea. The economic crisis, they said, will not be paid for by burdens placed on the mass of people who were not responsible for producing the crisis and who have already suffered its consequences. The specific issue was no austerity program. That's what it's called in Europe when the government lays off workers and cuts back on social programs. And though these were marches and demonstrations against austerity. If you haven't been paying attention, or even if you have, but you're subject to the usual media in the United States, you do not know that this is the culmination of months of this activity. On the 7th of September, earlier this month, the French trade unions, all 6 federations, united and had a general strike there, which drew 2.5 million people into the streets. And just to give you an idea numerically, since I'm an economist and I play with numbers, the French population is about 1/5 the population of the United States. So 2.5 million in France would be 12.5 million on demonstration in the United States. That has never happened in the history of this country. I'll give you an idea. The crisis is therefore in Europe, and one line that I will come back to at the end is that this is going to happen here too. The crisis in Europe is beginning to change its character from an economic phenomena to becoming a political phenomena. That's how big is the issue. That's how big is the problem. And the government on the edge of collapse now is the government of France and Mr. Sarkozy, whose popularity has dipped below that of George Bush in his worst month. And that's not a happy place for a political leader to be. Okay, here are the issues then I would like to address with you this evening. First, is the crisis over or is it deepening? I'm going to argue with you that it's deepening. And second, what is being done and why isn't it working? Because if the crisis is deepening, given all that has been done, then clearly what has been done doesn't work. And I need to address a little bit why that might be. And then finally, I'm going to be so bold as to suggest to you what kinds of alternative solutions are going to have to be dealt with if we're not going to suffer a downturn for an indeterminate amount of time. We hear a lot in our government in recent years about an open-ended, endless war against terrorism that seems to have no end, no boundaries. One of the thoughts I'm going to leave you with is we may be entering into a much more important long-term struggle with an economic decline that has no fixed dimensions and no boundaries either. Okay, so let's turn first to whether this crisis is over or not. I don't think so, not even close. We did have, and there was much attention paid to it, something called a recovery. It lasted from the depth of the bottom of the stock market, roughly March of 2009, and it was over by March of 2010. During that time, three things got a little better in the United States. Number one, the financial condition of our banks, particularly our big ones. Number two, there was a recovery of roughly half or so of what the stock market had lost. And number three, corporate profits rebounded from the worst times they had had in 2008 and 2009. All of those developments are now over. That is, if you saw today's announcement, the second quarter growth in the United States was about 1.6, 1.7%. That's a level of growth that is inadequate simply to provide jobs for the new people entering the job market. It can and will do nothing for all the unemployed. And indeed, the perspective now is that unemployment, this is the official perspective of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unemployment in the United States is likely to rise over the coming months. Not only not fall, but to rise. Bank situation has not gotten any better in several months now after that recovery. Same thing with corporate profits, same thing with the stock market. I would submit to you that the recovery was a recovery only in part and for very limited sectors of the American economy. The sectors who were the beneficiaries of the massive intervention of the United States government starting in 2008. That money that was thrown at banks improved their situation. Let me remind you, the rationale for the focus on bank improvements, buying their bad assets, which the government did, guaranteeing their obligations, because they couldn't anymore, which the government did and is still doing. All these things, throwing all this money at the banks, was given a rationale to unfreeze our credit system, to enable these banks to then make the loans to individuals and businesses that would get our economy going again. This was naive, if not dishonest. As any banker would have told you, and has been willing to tell anybody who's willing to listen, the problem in 2008 was, one, that they had lent money to people they should never have lent to. Number two, that we were an economy in free fall, and the last thing a prudent banker will do under those circumstances is make loans. Consequently, the banks took the money from the government, rebuilt their own balance sheets, improved their situation, and did not make loans, since that was the way to do that. So they made no public loans. In fact, what they did is turn around, use the money the government made available to them to buy the debt of the government so it would have the money to help them. If you understand that, not only do you get an A in high finance, but you will understand the games that are being played in this crisis. So that's number one. Number two, the improvements in the stock market, which have now sputtered, and the improvements in corporate profits. In the case of the stock market, it was simply jumping into a very depressed market and bouncing back with it, which is done with money when it's very cheap to borrow money, and because the interest rates had been lowered so much, this was a game that could be played and was played out for about a year and is now over. In the case of corporate profits, they renewed because not only did the government give all kinds of subsidies, the stimulus program buying their output, but likely also they cut their rolls, they eliminated lots of workers, they pared everything down, which improved their profitability, but of course contributed to the unemployment. So what do we get? We get a situation of improvement in three sectors: banking, stock market, and corporate profits. Well, what happened to the rest of the economy across this time? Well, perhaps the most dramatic statistic is an interesting statistic called the number of paid jobs available in our economy. That number, if I could show it to you, and I don't want to take the time to do it, is a straight line down from December of 2007 to the present. There are 6% fewer jobs in the United States, paid jobs, today than there were when this recession began in December of 2007. That not only means we have less jobs for our people, but of course we have more people now than we did then, so we are again falling further and further behind. The unemployment rate shot up to around 10% and has stayed there. Even more importantly, one of the particular unemployment rates, and by the way, the government keeps quite a few unemployment statistics. One of them, called U-6, number 6 among the many unemployment measures, is an interesting number, and I bring it to your attention. It adds together 3 kinds of unemployment. The number of people looking for work, adults looking for work who are not finding it, the number we usually call unemployed, who, by the way, went from roughly 7 million in December of 2007 to 15.5 million today. But it takes that number and it adds 2 other categories. Excuse me. People who have a part-time job even though they want a full-time job, and people who have given up looking for work, who the statisticians give a wonderful name to, discouraged workers, which is one of those euphemisms you'd want to keep in your mind. If you add together the unemployed, the involuntarily part-time workers, and those who are discouraged and stopped looking, we're talking between 25 and 30 million Americans, an unemployment rate officially of a roughly 18%. That means more than 1 in every 6 members of the workforce of the United States is in one of those categories. And that means every single American family has somebody in that situation. If not mother, father, son, daughter, then cousin, uncle, aunt, or someone else. This is a crisis that affects everyone and continues to affect everyone. There's been no end to the level of unemployment. Indeed, it is getting worse if you take the larger number. It is getting worse if you look at the number of weeks the average unemployed person is without work, which is at a historic high, etc., etc. The same applies to foreclosures of homes, running now at 2 to 250,000 procedures begun every month in the United States, legal procedure, to throw people out of their homes. And if we look at the people who haven't lost their homes and who haven't lost their jobs, here's what we find. The value of homes has dropped in the United States, roughly 25%. In some places more, in some places less, but as an average. Which means if you own your home, it's worth a good bit less than it was 2.5 years ago. If you have a job, it has poorer benefits, lower benefits. If you have a job, it has less security associated with it, less opportunity for advancement. The conditions of the working class, the vast majority of people, have been horrible and not improved in a significant way for the duration. There's been no recovery. When you read about anxiety, that there might be a double dip, for the vast majority of people, there isn't a double dip because it never went up to dip again. It's been a straight downward trajectory. What does this mean? It means that the efforts of the United States government, massive efforts of intervention, unprecedented in some cases, undertaken by the Bush administration when it was still in power, and then done in a bigger scale, if anything, by the Obama administration, has not succeeded. It has not ended unemployment, not come close. It has not stopped the foreclosure and loss of homes by millions of Americans, not at all. And it has done nothing to turn around the declining wage level, the declining benefit level, the declining job security, everything I mentioned. It is not a success. And likewise, the regulation of the American economy, to which a lot of people looked both during this crisis and in the past, is also a story of pretty abject failure. Let me quickly remind you. In the last occasion when the American economy collapsed, 75 years ago in the 1930s, we had a collapse on the scale of this one. Worse, at least for the moment, than this one. But this is, after all, an economic system that has now collapsed twice in 75 years. The agency that keeps track of the ups and downs of the American economy is called the National Bureau of Economic Research. They're the ones who announced a few weeks ago that this recession ended in 2009. They keep track. Between the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of the one we're in now, there were 11, according to them, business cycle downturns, during each of which millions of Americans lost their jobs, businesses went bankrupt, the economy turned south, etc., etc. And some of them were very severe, like the one in the 1970s that some of you may remember, when New York City went technically bankrupt as part of that wave of crisis. We live in a fundamentally unstable economic system to which every effort has been applied by Republicans and Democrats alike to avoid it, to minimize it, to prevent it in the future. Every president since Franklin Roosevelt has not only supported whatever measures he put in place as a way to get out of the recession they were in at the time, but every president, starting with Roosevelt, promised solemnly that the measures they were asking the Congress and the people to support would not only get us out of the crisis we're in now, but, and then there was a pregnant pause in front of the radio microphone or the TV camera, make sure we don't have this kind of crisis in the future, that we do not subject our children to what we're going through. Every president promised, and every president broke the promise, or was at the very least, if we're to be kind, unable to deliver on that promise. That is why we're in one now, and that's why we have so many and have them so regularly. So the armature of monetary and fiscal policy and regulation didn't work. Didn't work, at least not to prevent crisis. The 1930s issued in major regulations. They too had a bank collapse. They too had a financial credit freeze. They passed, in case you're interested, very important regulatory changes. Perhaps one of the most famous, something called the Glass-Steagall Act in the middle of the 30s. It was to prevent investment banks and commercial banks from mixing their money and their activities together. It was thought dangerous for banks that have a deposit they have to give back to you and me to be able to use that money for long-term investments in a company that they couldn't liquefy, couldn't get it back into cash quickly. So a rule was passed. These two banks have to be separate. If you do one kind of banking, you can't do the other. We know what happened, or if you don't, let me quickly tell you. The banks who opposed that bill being passed in the 30s understood, as regulated businesses always do, that if you lose the struggle to prevent a regulation, there's still plenty of fight. You can work after there's a commission there, after there's an agency there, after the law is passed, to make sure it doesn't work in the intended ways. You can evade it, you can weaken it, and if you're strong enough, you can eliminate it. Glass-Steagall is a perfect example. First, they designed ways to eliminate it. Then they were able, after a couple of decades, to weaken it. And under the presidency of William Clinton, they were able to repeal it. And we're now back to square one. The only difference is the next set of regulations. All the regulated companies have accumulated half a century of experience in how to evade, weaken, and eliminate, so they can now do it much quicker. And we could see that in this last summer's exercise in futility, the Financial Regulation Bill. I won't bore you with the details, but the amount of regulation that that bill will subject our financial industry to is very small. It's very small because hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by the banks and hedge funds and others in the United States lobbying the Congress, that's legal, and they did that above board, to make sure the regulation was minimal. So let me make clear, in the hopes that you all get it, where did the banks get the money to lobby the government to minimize the regulation? From the government that bailed them out. So on behalf of the banks, I want to thank each and every one of you for the kindness of providing the funds to make sure they were not encumbered by unfortunate regulations that they would prefer not to have. And I think you should feel good of being able to help them in their time of travail. Okay, what did the government do in a fundamental way that we can summarize, because we don't have all night, that might explain why none of this worked, why we have a deepening crisis? We are in the last months of the third year of this crisis. This hit in the autumn of 2007. We are now in the autumn of 2010. This is the third year with no end in sight. What is going on? Basically, what the government did in all the bailouts and so forth, and in the stimulus program, was to try to improve the balance sheets, the condition, the financial condition of the financial industry, number one, and of industry in general, number two. That was the strategy. You unfreeze credit, you get the credit going again by taking care of the banks, making them whole again. And there, the largest thing the government did was basically an interesting act. They moved bad loans, bad assets, mistaken investments off of the balance sheets of the private entities that had made them and transferred them onto the government's balance sheet. We basically substituted public debt for private debt. That doesn't solve an economic problem. It just moves it. It displaces it from the private sector, which is in immediate danger, and has the government take over. If we had time, I would now allow myself lots of sarcastic humor about a society that celebrates private and excoriates public, having such a collapse that everything becomes dependent on the public. Just give you one small statistic. 98% of all mortgages written in the United States over the last 18 months have either been guaranteed or purchased by the United States government. Without the United States government, there would be no private mortgages written in the United States. There'd be no housing market. The value of your apartment, if you own one, would have gone much further down than you'd see now, and we would be talking about an economic crisis of gargantuan proportions. As a result, the federal government keeps shoveling, and I use the term advisedly, shoveling money into the agencies that buy all the mortgages that private banks, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you've heard their names, they are all losing billions and billions of dollars that taxpayers are funding so that they can keep the housing market going, because without the government, there wouldn't be one. But I'm not going to allow myself the sarcasm. I just want to focus you on what it means if the government comes in and supports an economy, either by taking the toxic assets off the bank balance sheets so they become property of the U.S. government, in short, yours, or the government borrowed money to stimulate the economy. Remember Obama's $800 billion stimulus? The payment for that was borrowed. So the government is taking bad assets onto its balance sheet, and it is borrowing record amounts of money, $1.7 trillion last year. Now let's look at that for a moment. If the government borrows to stimulate the economy, and by the way, why does it do that? Because individuals and businesses are not buying anything. They're terrified of where the economy is going, and they're on a buyer's strike. The government comes in and substitutes its own purchases for the purchases not being made by the private individuals and private corporations. So the government borrows. And our government has gone, like governments around the world, into massive, unprecedented levels of peacetime debt in order to do this. Not only is the government doing this, but this is put forward by all kinds of fellow economists and the public as a stroke of genius, as a deficit spending program that is going to solve our problem. As if borrowing like that has no consequences we need to worry about. As though we can blithely just borrow and it really won't matter and it will not be a problem, and we'll fix that all in the future when our economy's healthy again, and then we'll run surpluses and that'll negate the deficits and everything will be back to square one. I don't mean to be unfair, but that is the position of my colleague, whom many of you read, Paul Krugman. That's what all the governments have been doing, borrowing like crazy. And it leads, among other things, to the following peculiar conundrum. When governments borrow, of course, there has to be a lender. Okay, who's lending to the United States government to carry out all of this? Well, here we have some peculiar answers. Number one, all kinds of wealthy entities, corporations, individuals, lend to the government, because that's safer and more secure than lending to anybody else in an economy like this, or investing in anything because things don't look so good. That's not a growth procedure. That's a churning of money. In fact, it's very ironic if you think about it, because if our government really didn't want to run a deficit, it could, of course, tax corporations and the wealthy. Then it could get the money to stimulate the economy without borrowing. It's even more interesting when you reflect that when the government doesn't tax corporations and the rich, choosing instead to spend money that it gets by borrowing, it goes to the same people to borrow the money. For the standpoint of a wealthy person and a corporation, if one has to choose between the government taxing it, end of story, versus the government coming to borrow it and use it for the same purpose and then pay you back with interest, that's not a tough call. I'd be a Keynesian deficit spending supporter myself if I were wealthy under these circumstances. So governments have been borrowing. I haven't the time again, but if I did, I'd enjoy talking to all of you about something I suspect you know, that there aren't enough Americans with enough money willing to lend to the United States government, so the borrowing we've been doing to keep our economy going has had to involve more and more borrowing by us from other countries. And the country in the world that has lent the most to the United States to help it out of the crisis of its capitalist system is the People's Republic of China. The communist government in China is financing the crisis activities of the capitalist government of the United States. Probably worth a few moments of thought, but not for the media here. But maybe you might think that some historical message might be lurking somewhere in this relationship. And even if you don't want to think about it, do think about this. If the estimates of the total amount of government and agency debt that the Chinese own is roughly in the neighborhood of 1.2, 1.3 trillion, which are what the estimates suggest, then it means, assuming the usual interest rates, that the United States government is now functioning as a collection agency for the People's Republic of China. Because every year we must send $50-60 billion to them in interest. So you should all feel good that when you drink a beer or buy a rubber tire or do anything that gives money to the federal government, that part of that will not be wasted on services or anything like that. Part of that is just a collection process. The government collects a portion of it and sends it to the People's Republic of China so they can build up whatever it is they're doing over there, which seems to impress a lot of people. And again, on behalf of the People's Republic of China, I want to thank each and every one of you for making this contribution. If that strikes you as a bizarre way to fix a crisis, good, that's my point. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The stimulus didn't work. Not only because it was borrowed money to which I will return, but if you stimulate, if you pump money into the economy, we are now an economy that loses a lot of the money we have because we import so much. Every one of you is wearing clothing that doesn't come from the United States. You know that. And you're driving cars that don't come from, and so forth and so on. So if you give money to the United States, people, businesses and people, it's hemorrhaged out of the United States. You're actually helping building jobs in other places with your stimulus. What is my point here? It hasn't worked. The stimulus didn't solve the unemployment problem. Making the banks whole didn't lead them to lend to produce jobs. It didn't work. Monetary and fiscal policy didn't work in these 3 years. And it shouldn't have been even tried because we knew it wouldn't work. And why do I say that? A little historical example. The last great collapse, 1929. Once Roosevelt got in, a few years later, he tried every monetary and fiscal policy that the Obama administration used. He tried that too. And it didn't work for him either. He kept trying. He kept running into the problems that monetary and fiscal policy lead to. He couldn't solve those problems. And the Great Depression lasted from 1929 at least a decade till 1939. We couldn't get the unemployment back down to what it had been before the crisis hit. What finally got the United States out of the Great Depression's unemployment was not an economic policy. Those didn't work. It was a radically different policy, a radical difference in America. We decided as a nation to go to war. We took half our unemployed people and put them in a uniform, and we took other half and put them into work in factories to make the uniform and the bullets and the guns. That's how we got the unemployment problem solved. The lesson should have been learned. Your normal run of monetary and fiscal policy, about which the great debates every day in the press resound, is a bit of a shadowboxing. It's a bit of a distraction. You might even call the conventional debates between conservative and Keynesian economics a kind of weapon of mass distraction. Because meanwhile, what's happening as they debate, as they go back and forth? A little more Keynesian policy on a more leftist 3 months, a little less Keynesian policy and a more conservative the next 3 months, or as government changes. Maybe after the elections in November, we'll go back to the right, and then when that doesn't work, we'll go wobble back to the left. Meanwhile, what's happening? I would argue with you, and I hope you get this message, that while this shadowboxing debate is going on, while we're all supposed to get terribly excited about whether you are in favor of deficit spending or you're not in favor of deficit spending, the cycle, the capitalist cycle, is working its way through its normal process. And what is its normal process? A period of unemployment that's extended until workers are willing to work for a lot less because they've been out of work long enough and the prospects look bleak enough that a job and a salary they would not have accepted before becomes something we'll have to settle for. Likewise, as the cycle unfolds and businesses go out of business, the cost of secondhand equipment drops because the sellers who are desperately going out of business outnumber anyone who's buying. And the rental cost of square footage goes down. And the lawyer you need to hire becomes desperate and willing to work for less, and on and on and on. And when does it stop? when the costs of doing business have been broken down far enough so that a capitalist, an investor, a businessman or woman sees the prospects of profit at such low wages and such low costs, and then they go in, and then the system has another period of growth for 2, 3, 4 years until we're back in the same instability of this system, which no section or collection of brilliant economists has ever been able to figure out how to stop or control. That's what's going on. And I submit to you, that's why so many Americans are angry, because they're living this process. For them, these debates are empty. They're not moved, they're not interested, they're not drawn into them. The clever repartees lost on them. They see insecurity, decline, and no end. Are we surprised that they're rageful and angry, that tea parties attract them, etc., etc.? I don't see why. That people in that situation begin to look for scapegoats, somebody to blame, the nasty bankers, the awful immigrants, or whoever. That's also par for the course. The history is full of this. We don't have a government with policies that can solve this problem, and they have proven that to us. But they have done something. They've now saddled the government with enormous debts. And that is the new problem. It's a crisis displaced. It's not so immediate on the private sector, although heaven knows it's still there. But the urgent problem is the government. All around the world, all the governments, they've borrowed up to here. And so they're discovering a problem. And again, to be simple, what's the problem? When a government borrows, you feel comfortable because it's the government. It's not just some person or some company. But if the government keeps borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, then the same anxiety of a lender that applies to a private borrower eventually applies to the government borrower too. And here's how it works. You're a big bank, you're an insurance company, you're the kinds of folks that lend to governments. And you see the rising indebtedness. And you say to yourself, uh-oh. As the government debts rise, the government has to use more and more of its revenue just to pay the interest and pay back the debts. So more and more of the money that people pay in taxes doesn't come back to them in the form of a service, of a school, of a firehouse, of an educational program, of an unemployment check, of a Social Security benefit. No, that's not available because the money has to go to pay off the lenders. And the lenders are not stupid. They know that this is not a sustainable arrangement. The political risk is that movements will develop that turn on their own governments and say, what are you, handmaidens for the lenders? Collection ladies, bag people, collecting our money and sending it to rich lenders, because that's who they are? Perhaps even foreign rich lenders? When in the United States, for example, will we awaken one day and have, I'll be mean for a moment, have Glenn Beck on the TV excoriating the American people to rise up so we stop sending our hard-earned tax dollars to the communists in China? Can this happen? Of course. Has it happened? Repeatedly. Some of you may remember this summer. It happened to a country called Greece. The lenders to Greece looked at the situation and they drew the following conclusion. The most militant labor movement, socialist and communist movement in Europe is probably the Greek population. If you look at them all, it's probably true. If any country is going to rise up and stop being willing to pay interest on debt rather than have needed services, it's those people. So the lenders to Greece said, we're not going to lend you any more money. We're not even going to renew the loans we have to you. It's unsafe. So you have to do one or the other of two things. in order to compensate us for the rising risk we see with you, you have to give us a much higher interest rate than we've ever charged you before. Of course, the problem for Greece would be if their people are angry at the amount of money they're paying in interest now, they will be in a white heat of rage if they would actually have to pay. But the lenders were adamant. You either pay us much, much more, and we don't care what happens in your country, or you're not getting any loans at all. And in the case of Greece, as in many other countries, that would mean the government couldn't function tomorrow. And whoever the political leaders are will be immediately thrown out by an enraged population that can't get to work on the subway. Footnote, historical footnote. The government in Greece at this time, during this summer and now, is the Socialist Party of Greece, who won the election and came to power a year earlier on the promise never to impose an austerity on Greece. But when the lenders came and said, you either do what we tell you or you're not going to be here next week, the Socialist Party is imposing austerity on Greece, or trying to. Greece has had 12 general strikes in the last 6 months. It's far from clear how that's going to work out. So the problem is debts. And the lenders are beginning to say, we want you all, including here in the United States, we want you to put money aside to make sure that the interest is paid and the money is paid back, or else we're not going to lend to you. That's a problem for the United States also now. Not the kind of problem it is for Greece. Greece is a small country, a poor country. Lending to them is more risky than lending to the United States. People prefer to lend here, but not limitlessly. In Washington right now, in case you haven't been paying attention, the government of the United States is confronting mounting pressure from lenders about the debts that we have and the debts we're projected to have for the next several years, deficits each year, and demanding major adjustments, or else the lending to this country is going to start atrophying. Signs in the wind. The People's Republic of China reduced by $100 billion its outstanding ownership of U.S. Treasury debt over the last year. First time they've done that. They're not keeping accumulating. They're not willing to keep lending. Lord help us if they dump the rest of what they have. Another sign in the wind. President Obama nominated a Western politician to be the head of a commission looking into the Social Security and Medicare systems. In order for the government to free up money to pay back the lending that it borrowed to solve the crisis in the ways I just showed you didn't work, the only way to do that is to go after the really big costs the United States government has that are on the table. And those are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And there's already talk about changing either the amount that is given to those people who will get those benefits, or charging you more when you go to the doctor if you're on Medicare, or all the other ways that this is being handled. And again, this is the transformation of an economic crisis into a political assault on the mass of people. That's what austerity in Europe has meant as they cut back. The general strike in France that 2.5 million people went out in the streets about was a general strike on a very specific issue. The Sarkozy government in France proposed that Social Security eligibility be moved from age 65 to age 67 for full coverage, and from age 60 to age 62 for partial coverage. 2.5 million people in France said, no, 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 no. That's not going to happen. And there are demonstrations Saturday on the 2nd of October, and again on the 12th in France, in front of the Senate and the General Assembly in Paris. This is becoming a war inside this society. Might even begin to say a civil war inside the society as to who's going to pay for this. And much of what is happening in Europe are prefigurations of the same issues here. I'm sure we'll handle them differently here. We do not have a unified, powerful trade union movement. We had one once. We don't have it now. I just described to you countries that have had general strikes and demonstrations. We've had nothing. We've had 3 years of a serious crisis. We've had nothing comparable. This Saturday in Washington, the NAACP, the AFL-CIO, and many other organizations are having a demonstration, sort of. It's like a conference, very mild, very peaceful, asking the president to do more about unemployment. That is a long way from what you can see if you look on the internet. Just tap in September 29th, Europe, and you'll have more photographs than you can possibly imagine of general strikes and all the street scenes of it. But I think it would be naive to imagine that the American people are just going to roll over and accept the implications of making the mass of the American people pay steadily, step by step, for the immense costs of bailing out this economic system we live in as it works its way through the second major collapse in 75 years. Let me turn then and work my way to a conclusion about how this is all playing out here in the United States, which is the society I'm most interested in and where I live. I think the mass of people have already come to the conclusion in this country that things could have been handled otherwise. That somehow the only way to proceed was not to throw all the money at the banks and take over their bad assets, was not to stimulate the economy by a stimulus program that buys lots of stuff from corporations in the hope that they will then hire people. It is a remarkable thing about the United States that these policies, even when they don't work, seem to have such a hold on us that we can't break free. Let me deal for a moment with what I think is a perception, even if it isn't yet fleshed out with the statistics. That's partly my job, of a sense in the American people that something could have been done about the job circumstances, the unemployment, that wasn't. We relied on an appeal to the private sector to hire. That went nowhere. And then subsidies in the form of demand by the government for products, and hope that that would stimulate companies to meet that demand by hiring people. And that didn't work either in the sense of solving our problem. I think the American people understand there's another option, even if they couldn't occur to them. And the reason they understand it is, first of all, it's very logical, but even more than that, it's our history as a nation. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt, confronted with an unemployment larger than what we have now, went on the radio and he said to the American people, if the private sector either cannot or will not hire the people, then the government will do it. Thank you very much. Between 1934 and 1941, the government under Roosevelt, he was the president the whole time, as you know, created 11 million jobs. 11 million jobs directly hired by the government to perform a task that the government assigned these people to do. They reclaimed all kinds of land. This was green economics long before the term existed. They built many of the national parks in the West that many of you I know have enjoyed. One of the most creative programs ever devised in the United States, the WPA, amazing program. The government hired actors, singers, sculptors, painters, poets, grouped them into troops and hired them and sent them all over the United States, particularly into smaller towns and smaller cities, which had never had an opera troupe perform before, or poetry lessons for the public at the public library on Saturdays. There was a distribution of culture to the American people greater than anything we had had before and anything we've had since. Wow. And those people all had meaningful work. And they all had an income, which means they all could maintain their mortgage payments and didn't lose their homes. And they felt real good about themselves. And all of that transmitted itself. Somewhere the American people understand at least the following question. Why in the world hasn't that been done again? what's going on here? If you repeatedly appeal to the private sector to solve the unemployment problem and they either cannot or will not do it, what? You just sit there? But of course, there was a difference in the 1930s, wasn't there? We had an explosive labor movement. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was sweeping American industry, organizing factories the way we had never seen it before. This was a powerful labor movement that was flexing its muscles and letting the government know, as the Europeans are doing now, you better do something. We had a strong socialist party. We had a strong communist party, again like Europe now. And so Mr. Roosevelt had the mass demand and the mass support for taking a step. He might not have wanted to, but he really didn't have much choice. And it at least reduced the unemployment. He could not get the Congress to make the program big enough to solve the unemployment problem. But he was able to go a lot further, transforming the lives of millions of Americans, for whom, by the way, Roosevelt became a quasi-saint. And if you know about the shape of American politics and the growth of the Democratic Party, it was never the same after that period of time. None of that is happening. There's not even a major effort by the Congress or the president to even debate the question of a public employment program. And it's not as though we're importing it from the Soviet Union or China. This is using a precedent of our own government, our own president, the same political party, and not that long ago. It's remarkable. But it sits there as an awareness, however unformed in people's minds, of a gap between what could be done and what is being done. And I think it's having profound political effects as it begins to move inside the American people as a sense of anger and resentment at what is happening to them. And I think a fear that this is going to continue. A few supportive statements. Earlier this week, the U.S. Census Department released a report about poverty in the United States. If you missed it, poverty is getting worse in the United States, significantly worse. Millions of people added to the number of folks living on below the poverty line, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, our poverty population is also changing in terms of age. Basically, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be poor, which means that the impact of poverty in changing and damaging your life is an impact we're going to have for decades into the future, since it disproportionately affects our young people. That is a very serious issue that deserves much more discussion than we're having. I also want to bring your attention to the changing distribution of wealth and income. In the 1960s, the United States was distinguished by having one of the least unequal economic systems in the modern industrial world. The gap between rich and poor was narrower in the United States than in places like France or Italy and so on. Now we have the dubious distinction of having the most unequal of the advanced industrial societies. For 30 years, our real wage in the United States, some of you know I work a lot on this and I've talked about it before, the real wage of the United States has basically gone nowhere. If you adjust the wages per hour of the average American worker for the price he or she pays for goods and services, that's what the real wage means, it is about the same today as it was in 1978. And Americans have reacted to that by borrowing money. That is, a way to keep consumption going when your wage isn't going up is you borrow, going into horrific debt, and work more hours and send more members of the household out to work, particularly the adult women who moved out by the millions into full-time work in the last 30 years. But when all the dust settles and you look at the numbers, the inequality got worse and worse because of it. More and more of the salaries of Americans are used to take care of their debts. And they're falling further behind. As the inequality grows, social tensions grow. What is interesting is in this crisis, the situation is getting worse. One of the reasons is that the crisis has disproportionately affected our housing industry. For most Americans, if they have any asset at all that's worth something, it's their home. It's by far the most important, valuable piece of wealth that most Americans have. In a crisis like this, where average houses have dropped by 25%, you have devalued the asset that most Americans count as their only significant piece of wealth. Therefore, their relative situation to the really wealthy has deteriorated. The gap has become more severe. And that is felt by the American people in the following statement that poll after poll shows us. A sense of a growing number of Americans that this country is going through some long, open-ended period of decline in the world, felt as a political decline, a cultural decline, a military decline, and an economic decline. And they don't know quite where to look and how to grasp all of its dimensions, but that sense and that feeling is as important in shaping our future as anything else that is happening as a consequence of this crisis. Okay. If this crisis is as severe as I've tried to suggest to you, it is. If there's no end in sight, and if the collection of governmental policies to try to cope with it have not worked, what then in the world is to be done? And I will conclude with comments on that. I'd like to use a metaphor drawn from farming, an activity I know many of you spend much time in. If you have a farm, it's possible that you also have a large building known as a barn. A barn is a very useful structure. It allows you to store wood and hay and keep your animals. It's vital for many, many farms to have a barn. And people who have farms get attached to their barns in all kinds of emotional and spiritual ways, given the importance of the structure and the time spent in it. So when a barn begins to tilt, when a barn begins to leak, when a barn begins to have many of its problems, there is an understandable effort to repair it, to fix it, to patch it up, to replace a windowsill, to all the rest. You keep doing that, and it takes more time and more labor as more and more of the barn begins to break down. At a certain point, an intelligent farmer and or her spouse says, listen, the amount of time and money that we are spending and the amount of losses we are suffering from a barn that has done its useful thing, has served us magnificently. But there comes a time when you have to say, look, there are nowadays radically new ways of constructing barns. Let's take this one down, save a few pieces and hang them on the wall so we remember, and build a new barn from the ground up. Okay? Try to keep this metaphor in your head as I go through my conclusion. We live in a kind of economic system, very particular kind. It's called capitalism. It's been around for a few hundred years, like a really good barn, and has served us well, like a really good barn. It is not working real well anymore. It has broken down globally twice in 75 years, and it is driving gaps between rich and poor, both across countries and inside countries, on a scale that ought to have any reasonable person terrified. It is producing anger and rage and violence that go with extremes of wealth and poverty that coexist close to one another, which modern technology means everybody. We all watch each other on television or on the YouTube or on Facebook or wherever. We, however, live in a country, more here in the United States than anywhere else in the world, which has as a legacy of a long and difficult Cold War an aversion, a fear, and a disinclination to ask the question, is capitalism the best way for us to organize the economic dimensions of our lives? We are the only country that does not have significant, large mass movements of people who answer that question, no, we can do better than capitalism. They mean different things by it, but that discussion, that issue is on the table in those societies, and more so today than it has been in a long time. It's on the lips of most of the people in the streets of Europe over the last 24 hours. We're afraid of that here. It's associated with scary prospects and a Cold War that is far from over in terms of its lingering effects. And I think that is something we have to begin seriously to think about. I think that's the lesson of this crisis that we dare not learn. Let me tell you what I mean. Are there alternatives to capitalist arrangements? Yes, but they're not the alternatives you may have thought about. In our society, as a legacy of the Cold War, when the issue even came up a little bit, it was always couched in the same terms. And I don't think these are the useful terms. And the terms I mean are this: more government or less government. Capitalism is somehow understood as less government, whereas socialism, communism, and those are more government. Or private enterprise, government enterprise. Or private market transactions versus government planning. You notice the dichotomy: more government, less government. Very strange argument. If you do any real concrete research, it dissolves on you. It doesn't make any sense. And let me give you why. The United States has been dependent on the government. Our economy is wrapped up with the government and has been from the day we were born as a nation. This notion that the government should be kept out of the economy, that's crazy. That's crazy. That's never been true, never been close. All of you have in your pockets, if you're lucky, this green stuff. Money. Most of you believe, more or less, that money makes the world go round. The money is a government monopoly. We did have early in our history a situation where we allowed others, private people, to make money. That was so chaotic, we forbade that a long time ago. So money, kind of crucial in our economy when you think about it, is a governmental activity. And so are thousands of other things. And in case you haven't had the time to do it, if you ever study the history of the Soviet Union, they never did without markets. Markets were everywhere in the Soviet Union, as they are in China, and as they always have been. An economy without markets? That, not at all. Or here's another one: private property. The revolution in Russia begins in 1917. The only way Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin come to power is they make an alliance between their tiny party, the Bolsheviks, and a really big party called the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which represented the peasants of Russia, who were a significant part of the population, 95%. And those peasants had one goal at that time: to get their own land, finally. And so the deal struck by the Bolsheviks with the Socialist Revolutionary Party was, we will demand socialism in the industry, the government takes it over, but we'll make a deal with you and we'll give you what the peasants want. So the day of the revolution, the communist government of Russia distributed land to all the peasants that was their private property. From 1917 to the end of the 1920s, for the first decade or more of the Russian Revolution, it was a revolution that gave people private property, that established much more private property than had ever existed in Russia before. So the idea that this thing can be understood as the negation of private, it's silly. Just like the idea of capitalism as the negation of the power of the state is an illusion. But I want to take it much further. We're not trapped by, we're not limited by anything that has been done as an alternative by the Soviet Union, China, or any of those models. We all know enough about the dangers of concentrated power at the top that we don't have to stop the conversation looking for alternatives to a system that doesn't work by imagining that all we can look at are those other models that we don't like either. What else might be thought about. And here I simply want to provoke you with something human beings have found to be an extraordinarily interesting alternative for a very long time. Suppose the problem isn't about more and less government. Suppose all societies are going to have to learn how to mix the central authority of a government with the decentralized authority of groups of people. That we need mixtures of some planning and some markets, which is what most countries actually have, and some public and some private, which is what most countries publicly have, and that's not the issue. Maybe the question is a different way of organizing production, the enterprise, the things, the institutions in our society that actually make the goods and services we all depend on. Here's a thought. Suppose we changed that. Suppose we changed the way we do an organized business so it worked like this. Monday through Thursday, you come to work at your job, and you do what you always did, your specific task, your skill, your specialty. On Friday, you come to work, just like you normally do, but you don't do your specific task. On Friday, you come, and at 9 o'clock, you sit down with all the other workers in your enterprise, whether they be 10 or 1,000. And you spend the day in meetings, and you decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits your work generates. In short, on Friday, you become the collective board of directors of your own enterprise. Everything would change. Every decision would change. If you recall, a few minutes ago, I told you that one of the great switches in the American economy that brought on this crisis was the end of rising wages in America around 1970s, when they flattened out and never rose again. If workers had run their own enterprises in the United States in the 1970s, that would not have happened. Workers would have gone on raising their wages, their real wages, as had been done for 150 years in America before that time. They would have raised their wages because their productivity was going up, as it did. They would have kept on sharing in their own rising productivity, as had been the case before. And then they wouldn't have had to borrow all that money. And we wouldn't have had the financial speculations built on that. We would have lived in a different kind of economic system. We wouldn't be living in a system in which the key decisions corporations make are made by a tiny group of people, a board of directors, 15 to 20 people, usually selected by the major shareholders of a corporation, another group of 15 or 20 people. They decide, those tiny groups, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And we live in an economic system that is the result of the decisions they make. And one of the first things that ought to occur to Americans is if the pattern of outcomes from those kinds of decisions are as systematically dysfunctional as they have been and now are, that the minimum reasonable thing to do among the questions we ask as a people is, ought we to question and change the way we organize doing business, the enterprises that we have to produce? And in case you're wondering, is this a new idea? It is not. All through the history of the modern era and back beyond it, there have been these other ways of organizing business. They have very interesting names some of you heard of. Co-ops, community enterprises, collective enterprises, all kinds of names. And you know, if I could argue for it for a moment, just to provoke you, at least into understanding that we ought to have been discussing this. Not that you have to agree with me, but that we should be discussing it. And that to not discuss it is to have a taboo that we really ought to question. If all the workers in an enterprise participate in the decision, there's a name for that. It's called democracy. It's a democratic way of organizing production. If you believe in democracy, I would want you to ask yourself a question. Does your belief in democracy mean it only happens outside the workplace, but not inside? And where did you get that idea from? Did Thomas Jefferson write, only here but not there? Not that I know of. It is our culture that celebrates democracy outside the workplace and somehow has decided it doesn't belong inside the workplace. And for those of you that are saying, well, how could all the workers get together to make the decision? That would be chaotic. To you, I would like to tell two little concluding historical parables. Once a time it was thought that the only way to organize any society was to have one man at the very top who was called the king or the emperor or the czar, and he had to make all the decisions and tell everybody what to do, and the very idea that we wouldn't have it that way would mean our society would crumble, our civilization would disappear, and we'd all become animals in the jungle. And then one day, in that funny country that seems to surface in these stories all the time, France, they cut off the heads of the kings, and lo and behold, things didn't fall apart at all. Turns out you can do without a king. Might not have thought it, but wow. Another parable. Once upon a time it was thought that when you reach puberty and so on, and becomes time to think about making a family, and you need to have a partner, that the only conceivable way to do that, of course, is to have your parents find you a suitable partner. You're too young, you haven't lived long enough, you don't know what you're doing, your hormones are racing around and confusing your judgment, so your parents would be the appropriate people to find you a partner. And that if we ever had the crazy idea to let young people actually go out there and look around themselves, why then the world would fall apart, the family would cease to exist, chaos and ruin would beset us all. And someday, somehow it emerged, not everywhere yet, but in most parts of the world, that when young people get to that age, they manage this process nicely, thank you very much, on their own. And try to tell their parents the least possible that they can get away with for as long as possible, most of the time, and for good reason. Turns out these things are not necessary. Here's a thought for you. Maybe a hierarchical way of organizing enterprise, with a tiny group of people at the top who make all the decisions, and a mass of people who do the work and have to live with the results of those decisions, even though they don't participate in them, is not necessary. And it might have some very powerful, positive transformations of getting people to be involved, not only in the life of the job, but maybe finally, if we get people to have power on the job, they might better understand the need to participate in the democratic processes in the community as well. We haven't been terribly successful there either. But I'm not arguing for this or that particular change, although you can see which one I like. I'm arguing that if we don't do it, if we stay with an economic system as dysfunctional as this one, and continue to find it impossible, as our political leaders do, as our mass media do, to raise the question of capitalism as a system, if we keep thinking monetary and fiscal policies will get us through this again with their sad record, if we choose to scapegoat, you decide it's the evil bankers, she decides it's the nasty immigrants, he decides it's Obama who is a socialist or some other crazy idea, then we will not solve our problems, and those problems are changing this country and changing it quickly in directions that ought to make you nervous about your own future and the future of your children. So this is an appeal for a recognition of what's going on and a breaking out of an inadequate set of categories with which to understand it. It hasn't worked, neither the system nor the procedures in place that are supposed to solve it. And that requires all of us to begin to take action and participate on a scale we have not before, because if we don't, the cost will be heavy. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad to entertain comments, questions, or anything else. All right, so there are two parts to the question. One part is about military spending and whether a change in the portion of our economy that's devoted to military spending would be at least a partial solution or response. And the second one was a more urgent statement of feeling that a lifetime of activism and marching and even being in jail hasn't produced change, or hasn't produced at least the changes that you had hoped for. I don't know how much I can say on the second one. It's, of course, a very important one. I have learned, and I've done a fair bit of that myself, I've learned over my lifetime that the more the folks in power tell you that they will not be affected by your marching, the more certain you should be that your marching is scaring the pants off of them. The statement that it makes no difference is simply a mechanism to try to get you not to do it. Never underestimate the impact of even a small number of people doing something. It means thousands of others who see it, who hear about it, now have a more realistic feeling about such a thing. It may take them several more months or years before they ever go, but the possibility of their going just got a little more real when they see you standing there doing it. It's not as strange, it's not as hopeless, it's not as impossible, because it's been realized by another person who's not so different from them. It's very, very powerful, and I think it would be a terrible shame. I'm not diminishing the price that those people who take the lead in that pay and the costs of it, but I don't think you should despair. It takes a long time, but when the change comes, it often comes very quickly. There's a famous quotation from a person named Lenin, whom I like to quote if for no other reason than simply the shock value of quoting Lenin. But he said once, sometimes it takes many, I'm going to mess this up, sometimes a few months feels like an eternity. And sometimes an eternity is transformed in a matter of minutes. So that time doesn't proceed in a straight line. You know, before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, nobody foresaw that. Nobody could imagine, in or out of the Soviet Union, that it would disappear. But it did. To use the old language, the contradictions and the tensions accumulated below the surface, but when they blew, things went very, very quickly. So it may take a long time of lots of little demonstrations, and then suddenly a large number of people get that idea, and the newspaper may not know where it got it, but it got it from all those little moments, number one. Number two, the thing with military spending is, and this may disturb some of you, but as an economist, I have to tell you, we have been dependent as a nation for a very long time. World War II got us out of the Great Depression. There's been an association ever since that war is a way to solve domestic problems. That was settled in the American consciousness. And it was one of the reasons, not the only one, why, even though the war was over, the military production never stopped, was kept on. And by now, every state in the Union, every city, is tied into networks that are involved with military production. To really withdraw, to really reduce our activities of a military nature would take a dramatic, massive intervention of this government simply to accomplish all the adjustments that we would have to make to that not being such an enormous part of our economic activity. It's not an argument not to do it, but it's an argument to understand you are not asking for a minor adjustment. You know, let's produce plowshares rather than swords in the same factory with the same work. It's not like that. Whole states in this country depend. Whole communities have been laid out, highway systems, river systems, for example, in the Southwest. There's a whole economic structure of this country has been built for 50 years around a central, massive, growing role for military spending. If you really wanted to do something about that, you would have to call it by its real name. You'd have to engage in massive economic planning to prepare for it, to execute it. You could not rely on the private sector. There's much too much of a vested interest that has been built up. Millions of Americans' income depend on this, their jobs, their homes, the viability of their neighborhoods, all of that. It's been too big a part of our economy for too long. So I think it would have to be dealt with in a kind of major reorganization. It is true that having no real enemy at this point and having not had one for 20 years might have been a window in which to afford an effort to do that. But that would have required the political will that simply wasn't there at that time. Yeah. Well, in terms of what I was saying and thinking in the first half of this decade, what overwhelmed me at that time was a sense that the American people and the economics profession, which is what I've been doing all my adult life, had simply not wanted to take account of an absolutely crucial event that begins this decade. I'm not talking about 9/11, obviously an important event. I'm talking about a financial event. In March of the year 2000, the first year of this decade, the American stock market crashed. I use the word advisedly. It crashed. The NASDAQ, which is really the most important of our stock markets now, reached a level around that time, a peak level of 5,000, it's an index of the stock market. It collapsed. It is today half or less than half of 5,000. It collapsed and it never recovered. And I remember thinking and talking with my colleagues, there is no way you can have a country as focused on stocks and stock markets as this one is, experience a collapse in a short amount of time of that magnitude without it shaping and teaching you about what's going on a scale that would require a massive discussion in this population, what to do, what this means, and what to do about it. We had none of that. We had a panicked government, so terrified that that collapse of the stock market would usher in a major recession, that they took an unprecedented step. They collapsed interest rates in the United States, drove them down faster, further than we had ever seen the Federal Reserve do before, pumped a huge amount of money into the economy. And of course, as we now know, looking back, the collapse of interest rates in a population of people whose wages hadn't been going up, so they were desperate to borrow, meant that they went and borrowed because there was no cost to it anymore, or relatively little. So we produced an exploded credit bubble as our way of preventing the collapse from the stock market spreading. But again, this is not a solving of a crisis. This is displacing it, like I said earlier today. We moved the crisis from the stock market to the realm of credit and housing finance and all of that. And it took a few more years, and then that went down. So I was in the first half of this decade saying the American economy is in worse shape than I have ever seen it in my life, something I keep saying. I say it today, and I meant it 5 years ago as well. But many of us who said that and who said this displaced crisis is only going to be worse for our having postponed dealing with it, like a disease, it's better to catch it earlier than later when it is spread, people did not pay attention. I remember giving talks where people would make fun of me because I sounded like a professor at the NYU Stern School of Business, whose name you may now have heard, named Nouriel Roubini. So people made fun of me. I sounded like Roubini. Mr. Roubini is now a culture hero around the world because he, who had a much bigger reputation than I did then, has been heard as a person who said it was coming. And of course, you look very smart if you say that, and then it hits the fan the way it did. But he was not the only one. I was not. There were plenty of people who said, my goodness, we're looking at this. This looks like a train wreck waiting to happen. And this is not a society that wants to hear it. And that's like a society that doesn't want to hear about capitalism having its limits. You know, every other economic system the human race has concocted has served for a while, gone through some changes, and then been set aside. Why would we want to believe that we've now arrived at a time and a place and a system that can't be improved upon, cannot be superseded, cannot have its time and then be asked to move on? What is this? What is this terrible fear? And exactly what does it support? The continuation of a system that has brought you here this evening because you're concerned that absorbs me on a scale, and I don't mind saying that to you, in a way that I've never had before in my life. I mean, I am on the radio and television and all this other stuff, and I don't deny for a minute the ego gratification it provides. There's plenty of that. But besides that, I am in this amazing situation that I'm talking to the audience all teachers want. People who really want to know, who have burning, urgent questions. Nothing makes us a better student for a teacher than someone with that kind of commitment. And I now go all over the place because people are really scared, for good reason, concerned, worried, and eager to try to do something to change what looks like a very kind of serious situation. I didn't have time, and it occurs to me I should have, to talk to you about another dimension of crisis in this country. And that is the impact of this crisis on state and local governments. All around this country, we have, this country is unique. We don't have everything done by one level of government. The federal government does some things, state government do other things, and then local city and town governments do others. We have a law in the United States, very interesting, very important. Cities and states are not allowed to borrow money for their ongoing budgets. That's forbidden. Only the federal government can borrow, and so it can spend more than it raises in taxes. Cities and towns can't do that. They can borrow money, but only for what are called capital projects, like building a sewer or a school, but not for their ongoing budgets. What this has meant is that as the crisis unfolds and as we have millions of unemployed people, the tax revenues flowing to cities and towns and states have collapsed. So every city and state and town has to come to some kind of resolution. The overwhelming majority, but not all, the overwhelming majority have decided, okay, if we're going to have less taxes coming in, we dare not raise taxes on those people who still have jobs to offset those that are not coming in from the unemployed, partly because raising taxes is the no-no of American politics, but also because in a time of economic difficulty, hitting up people for more taxes, your average person, would seem to be absurd and dangerous. So basically what most cities and towns are doing are cutting back. They have less revenue coming in. So what? They lay off public employees. They cut back on public services. Now, stop. Let me repeat that. Cities and towns are cutting back in states. In California, tens of thousands of state employees have been fired. Teachers, crossing guards, policemen and women, and all of that. Here in New York, we saw a governor propose seriously, and I don't even know exactly where it is, that the subsidy given to school children in New York who were allowed to ride on the subways and buses without paying for the ride to and from school, this was to be taken away. We were going to make it harder for the young kids to get to school. A society that does that to itself is shooting itself in the foot. It is a system, it's a sign that a system is dysfunctional. But think even in the broader terms. When you have an economic downturn, the need for the services the state provides are greater. The unemployed person's child is having more trouble in school, not less. We know that unemployed people have more physical problems, more mental problems, more familial stresses, and all the rest of it. We need more from the government, but because the taxes to the government are less, it gives us less when we need more. Friends, that's a sign of a dysfunctional system. And everywhere, this kind of exacerbation, when the state government in California lays people off, it worsens the unemployment problem. So we respond to an unemployment problem by having the cities and states lay off more people. That's a dysfunctional system. But I told you not everywhere. So let me give you a piece of good news in case you haven't heard it. There was a state in the United States suffering from the crisis that cut back all of its tax revenues drastically, as has happened to every state. But this state, one of the 50, decided it was not going to lay off any public employees and not going to cut any public services. I won't keep you in suspense. The state is Oregon. Anyone here from Oregon? Okay, I would have applauded you at this point. Here's what happened in Oregon. In the summer of 2009, when the crisis hit, the legislature in Oregon passed a bill. Both houses passed it. The bill said, we are not going to cut services, even though we anticipate a $700 million shortfall of revenue over the 2 years, 2009, 2010. We're not going to lay off any public employees. We're not going to cut any services. We're going to solve the problem, here we go now, by raising taxes on business and raising taxes on wealthy people, where wealthy people were defined as those earning over $250,000 per year, families. They passed that in the legislature of Oregon. They delivered the bill to the governor, who signed it. At that point, the business community, the wealthy, and the Republican Party went crazy in Oregon. And because it's Oregon, our western states have the very easy way to force a bill that's been passed by the legislature to be subjected to a referendum. They believe in the direct democracy. We don't have that crap here in the East, but in the West, they think that's important. So it's very easy in places like Oregon to get a referendum. So the business community very quickly collected the signatures to force an election. And the way it works in Oregon, as in other Western states, is this. If the majority of the people who go to vote on the day of the election vote against the bill, it's nullified. The fact that the legislature passed it and the governor signed it are overwhelmed. They're canceled by the action of the people. And by the same token, if the people vote for the bill, it's then instantaneously the law. On January 10th, I believe it was, of this year, 1.2 million Oregonians went to the polls and clearly and decisively supported the bill, and that's the law. So the idea that we couldn't possibly here in America solve the problem of cities and states worsening the crisis is simply not true. Of course we can do that. Oregonians did it. And I mean Oregonians. That was a people, 1.2 million people of the state participated in this decision and voted clearly. I think it was 56% in favor, which was more than they needed, to make this the law. And I can see from some of your faces you're wondering, isn't it now possible that a business will leave Oregon to escape this, or a wealthy person? Sure, it's possible. But this would be an escalation of a conflict. Everybody can play. This is a tit-for-tat kind of arrangement. If the business threatens to leave, now the question will be, what will the state do confronted with such a step? Ditto with wealthy people. The state has a lot of resources and a lot of recourse to all kinds of steps. If you really want to take on the state of Oregon, you're going to have quite a struggle, and it's going to last, and the outcome isn't so clear. So guess what? Very little movement by the businesses, very little movement by wealthy people. Because remember, the wealthy people also have to worry that if they leave and they move to another state, that's very expensive. And where they go might do the same thing. And one of the reasons I try to tell the story of Oregon, and I won't embarrass anyone here, is because like the big demonstrations in Europe over the last 24 hours, the coverage of the unique steps taken by Oregon is rather poor across the United States. So that most Americans couldn't imagine such a step, or if they heard the story, would think it applied to Kiev or Beijing, but not to the good old US of A. Yeah.
When the average American, and I'm an average American, wakes up every day, he's confronted by a spate of advertisements for credit cards and facilities to indent himself to a third party. And all too often, in my case personally, and in the case of my fellow citizens, we yield to these blandishments. We indent ourselves to a bank, to an institution, with all the severity that indenting oneself to another person or another entity in a society entails. We indent ourselves for our education, and we blithely march along, pridefully looking at the number of credit cards we have, excited about the fact our children have a series of credit cards, and really accepting with a sanguinity the fact that our lives are dictated by our credit score. How is it that a group of people, myself included, so benignly and with great sanguinity accept this plight?
Okay, let me very briefly tell you the story why I think that is. And it has to do with something remarkable and unique about the United States. From the time we became an independent nation and broke away from Britain, as best we can tell from the historical statistics we have, 1820 to 1970, a 150-year period, real wages in the United States rose. And there was a simple reason for that. It wasn't that employers were nice folks. I mean, I'm sure they were, but they didn't do this out of the goodness of their heart. They were very successful. Capitalism grew quickly in this country, and there was always a labor shortage. After all, the people we found when we came here, we did away with, so they couldn't work. And so we never had quite enough people. We brought black folks here against their will, and we brought waves and waves of immigrants because we were always short of the labor that was needed to allow growth to happen as much as capitalists were interested. One result was it was always a problem for a businessman or woman to get a worker and to keep a worker, because it wasn't just a question of getting them. Because we had a big open country, a worker who you didn't treat right and who didn't like his job or her job could run away and get some land in the West. And so it was, in order to get a worker and keep him, we had to raise wages. So for 150 years, 1820, 1970, wages, real wages, what you could actually get for your money, kept rising. No other capitalist country ever produced that for its work. It's absolutely unique. Those of you who've heard the phrase American exceptionalism, something unique about it, that's it. That's the core idea. Americans began to believe that there was something magical, spiritual, special about the United States. Nowhere else in the world did you have rising wages all the time. People undertook the perilous danger of leaving wherever they came from in Europe and beyond to come to the United States in the hope that they'd have a better life here. It was a reasonable hope, and most of them realized it. And it began to be the American view that it's kind of built into America. Each generation will live better than the one before. You'll do better than your folks, and your children will do better than you. And it's you work hard and you'll get ahead. And other people don't think like that. Americans could indulge that view because it happened here. They didn't attribute it to a labor shortage. You need a lot of kind of help to see that. So they attributed to good luck or the beneficence of a lovely God who'd shone on the United States in a way that he or she didn't shine elsewhere, etc. By the time you get to the 1970s, this is a way Americans have of evaluating themselves. I'm a person who started with relatively little, and look at me now. Every president tells that story, whether it's true or not, because it's part of our national heritage. I worked hard, and everybody believes it because that's the story of the United States. Imagine with me for a moment, what would happen, be an amateur psychologist, what would happen to a population that for 150 years has internalized the idea that I'm going to live better, and I'm going to deliver to my children the American dream of living still better. Suppose suddenly that the one thing that made that all possible, rising wages, stopped. Suppose the 1970s was the end of rising wages and they never rose again, which, by the way, is exactly what happened. What would these people do? Of course, they could decide, well, happened to be born at the wrong time, so the American dream is over, and I tell my children, screw you, it's not going to happen for you. I'm the last one. You can't go to community college because the money isn't there. You can't. It's over. Well, we might have had such a population reaction if there had been a national debate about, wow, the world has changed. Our history is now different. We have to make up. None of that happened. There was no discussion at all. So each American working family experienced this as their own failing. I'm not able to deliver the American dream. Other people are, but I'm not. So I've got to be the disappointing parent that tells the children, you're not going to get the good news. You get the crap. Most people can't do that. And if the cost of participating in the dream, even when your wages don't permit it, is for you to go into debt, that's a small price to pay. The party continued. From the 70s through 2, 3, 4 years ago, Americans convinced themselves that they could eventually pay it off, that there would be a better job down the road that would allow them to pay down the credit card. Meanwhile, they could deliver to their wife, their husband, their children, the kind of medical care, the kind of education, the kind of occasional vacation. Come on, we're the people who invented advertising. We're the people who defined consumerism. We measure one another by the house we live in, the neighborhood we live in, the car we drive, the clothes we wear. You know the story. That's not because we're peculiar people, because we lived in a culture that celebrated this consumerism. Of course we would be the ones to lead the way, as we have been, for working people to borrow. And by the way, the business community understood it. Advertising was born here. It understood, as it does to this day, that the best way to get you to buy what you cannot afford is to make you believe it's part of the American thing, and if you don't have it, you're not really in the club. And therefore you're strange, you're weird, you're off somehow. And remember also that the business community saw the wealth for them in this. You know, in the United States, working people, for most of the history of this country, could not get a loan. You could not get a loan because you had no collateral. The vast majority of Americans had no property. They didn't even have a house. So if they went to a bank, they couldn't borrow money from a bank because you got no collateral, no security. Only, by the way, in the 1930s, a little history lesson. In the 1930s, to get us out of the Depression, Roosevelt thought through a clever idea. He would create a demand, an upsurge in the economy by a radical new thing, giving individual Americans their own home. But of course, here was the problem. Americans don't have any money. A house is expensive. Your salary, you can't buy a house. End of story. The only way you could buy a house is if someone lent you the money. But the banks would never lend the money because you're too risky as a worker. How do you solve this problem? Solution. The government established the federal FHA, the forerunner of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and gave the government a guarantee. The government basically went to the banks and said, give the Smiths a mortgage, because even if the Smiths can't pay you back, the government will. Oh, well, at that point, the bank is willing to lend money to the Smiths. It's another little lesson in, without the government, nothing called suburbs would ever have happened in this country. Right? So it is a step in which the government moved, and we had then a kind of consumer revolution around your house. But it's the history of America to provide the American people with consumer goods. We would have had to come to a massive change in our society to cope with the end of rising wages. We never did it. And so every family tried some other way, worked more hours. Teenagers went to work. The women went out to work. But when that wasn't enough, we borrowed. And the banks were there, and they said, not only will I give you a loan backed up by the house, backed up by the government, but, and this started in the 70s, I'm going to give you a new kind of loan that I've never given you before. I'm going to give you a credit card. Only rich people had credit cards before the 70s. The American Express and a couple others, that was for wealthy people. A mass phenomenon like that, it's called, in economics, it's called unsecured credit, a credit card. There's no collateral. The bank can't go after anything. There's no property it can take if you punt on your credit card. Solution. Get the government to allow the charging of interest rates off the roof, way higher than than a mortgage. A mortgage over the last 40 years has averaged 5-6%. Credit cards have averaged 15 to 20%. Credit card is the most lucrative way to lend money to masses of people. It became possible in the 70s as the banks discovered that the American worker whose wages weren't going up anymore was desperate to participate in the consumer culture that he and she had been taught to expect as their birthright as Americans. And the banks discovered there's no end to how much credit these people will absorb. And they were right. And you produced a generation of people who are in way over their heads, which, by the way, is now, in a perfect example of chickens coming home to roost, is now coming back to haunt us. Because one of the reasons our economy is not coming out of the crisis is that consumers are not buying. They're choosing to take their money to reduce their debt because they've been traumatized by what happened to them when they couldn't cover their debt. They see the people next door losing their home because they can't make their debt payments, and they see the car repossessed and the TV taken out and all the rest of it. And you're going to have now a long time where Americans are hesitant to shop, and that is going to affect our economy yet again. The idea that these are all solutions that have no long-term consequences is part of the American hesitancy to see us caught up in a system. And the system isn't working, and a little fix over here and a marginal adjustment over there, it's like another repair on the barn that has outlived its usefulness. First of all, you're right that we have been moving work out of the United States, jobs, for a long time. Neither Republicans nor Democrats have really done very much about that. The major corporations in the United States are almost all involved one way or another in this process. I like to remind people that, just a simple statistic, but it speaks volumes. Roughly 60% of the goods that come to the United States from China, made in China, are made by the subsidiaries of American corporations in China. So while it is correct to say they're imports from China, that's true, the implication that it is somehow Chinese enterprises or Chinese businesses that are producing, that's a mistake. The majority of that stuff is an American company that, for the reasons you specified, goes over there because it's more profitable to produce there and ship it here than to make that material here. And I don't imagine really anything that I could reasonably expect from Republicans or Democrats or any of the usual types of folks making policy is going to do much about that, since the demand of corporations has always been that they want the freedom to do that. And they tell terribly dire stories that if we don't do that, then it'll be only Chinese people who make it, and et cetera, and it'll be even worse, is the basic message. So what do you do about this? Well, if you're going to leave the decision-making in the hands of private corporations, then you can only expect more of what we've had. But it's clear, for example, that if enterprises were organized differently, if the workers inside the enterprises made the decisions, one of the decisions they're highly unlikely to make is to close the place and move it to China. They're not likely to do that. And they wouldn't have done it. It would make no sense, and they wouldn't do it. Just as it makes sense for the existing organization of enterprise to do it, it would not make sense for people to eradicate their own jobs, their own lives, their own communities. Not going to do it.
What about the American consumer? The American consumer doesn't want to pay 10 times more for the T-shirt.
Right, that's the standard answer. What about the American consumer? Okay, so now we have to balance. We have to balance the needs of the American worker with the needs of the American consumer, who are, after all, the same people. So we'd have to balance that out. And here's a thought. We might have balanced it as follows, that the government, in order to facilitate cheapening the cost of life, would put an enormous effort on developing new technologies to provide cheaper goods and services here in the United States to the workers in the United States, in order that they not leave the country with the jobs. In other words, you'd make this an explicit goal of policy. That's not a mirage. That's not an impossibility. I want to remind you, we have had at various times in our history a determined effort to get something done. When we have been able to mobilize large numbers of people and large amounts of resources to make breakthroughs in production and technology. You know, we invented the atomic bomb because we felt threatened as a nation. So everyone from Albert Einstein to Robert Oppenheimer and all the others involved in that were, you know, in Los Alamos out in the desert. Unbelievable amounts of resources and personnel were brought in to solve a problem. And that was a harder nut to crack than to make an arrangement in which we spend some resources to lower the price of consumer goods as the cost for keeping the jobs here, for allowing people to continue to have productive lives here. And you know something, in the course of the technological effort that would involve, my guess is we would discover 50,000 other products that American companies could then become. You do know how breakthroughs like the computer and so on, that's not a private enterprise. The computer was developed at MIT under contract from the United States Department of Defense as part of the war effort way back in World War II and in the Korean War. And then that was delivered to the private sector. But it was a public concerted effort that transformed technology and transformed our economy. The only difference now would be that it would be designed around a program to maximize the welfare of the American people as workers and consumers. Nothing like that is going on now. We are leaving it to the private profit-making decisions of those corporations to decide when, where, how it's profitable for them to move to Panama or Bangladesh or somewhere else. And we all live with the consequences, but we do not participate in the decision. Let me use an argument from economics. We teach students in economics that an economic decision, like building a factory or moving a factory, should only be made after something called a cost-benefit study is undertaken. And here's what that means. You look at all the costs, kind of all the bad things that will happen if you move a factory over there, and you then weigh that against all the good results that will come from it. And the basic rule is if the total of good results outweighs the bad consequences, it's a good thing to do. And if the bad outweigh the good, you shouldn't do it. Not a complex idea. Okay, now let's look at the decision of Company A to move to China. The good things are cheaper labor, no environmental rules, facilities provided by the Chinese government, so forth and so on, and that'll all make great profits. Good news for the company. Now let's look at the costs. Decimated community, empty factory, broken civil services because there's no money anymore coming. All the costs, I'm exaggerating, but not by much, all the costs, ready, are not costs for the company. They're the costs that are borne by the community, by the neighbors, by the children of the workers who have to live with the company is not required to cover the costs. If you look at the costs, they outweigh the benefits. The move should never have been made. But because the decision maker doesn't look at the costs and doesn't have to bear the costs, the decision maker makes a decision that is not the one society needs. The employer goes because they get the benefits and they don't have to pay the costs. Somebody else pays the costs. We do. And by the way, if you want to see the cost to the United States, there's a little personal footnote. Find a way to visit the city of Detroit, and you will see something that really no words can describe as to what can happen to a society like ours when you enable decision makers to go where they can get benefits and leave the costs behind for everybody else to pay for. As long as we leave this situation that way, we really have ourselves to blame for not having stopped a system that is now functioning dysfunctionally, not well, bad outcomes. We should never have allowed this, but now it is really transforming us so that we have more and more parts of cities looking like Detroit. Sorry, ma'am. On the latter point, it's again an example of bringing the resources and the skill of the United States, which are very impressive, to bear in a concentrated way. But that has to be a social program of the government. They would have to do it. My guess is all kinds of wonderful products could be made in the old GM plants, but you would need all the government support to make that possible, to fund the research, to develop the transportation, and all the associated things. Right. That would be a different kind of stimulus, just like hiring large numbers of people would have been. On the medical, it's a good way to end since we've run out of time. Let me say to you only the following. And I'm sure most of you know it, but it bears repeating. Every other advanced industrial country in the world has a national health insurance program. They do that for a simple economic reason, among other reasons. The healthier your population, the more productive. The healthier your population, the more civic and civility you have in the interactions of people in the course of their days and their lifetime. It really is, in the end, a right to be educated, to be at peace, to have a public park to go to, and to have your medical needs attended to. In every advanced industrial country that has a national health insurance, which is almost all of them, or is all of them, the cost of medical care delivered to the people is significantly lower than what it is here. And the medical outcomes are better. They live longer. They have fewer children die in the first year of age. Their diseases do not last. I mean, all the indices we know of, they all point to the same thing. So what have we got? I would argue it's the same thing I just told you about companies moving out. For the drug companies, for the medical insurance companies, for the hospital companies, they're privately profitable in the system we have now. They want to keep it. They don't pay the cost of the fact that your husband dies 3 years before he really needs to. That's your problem, his problem, the company that employs his problem. But it's not their problem. So they are doing something that is good for them. And I want to remind you, that's how this system works. The board of directors of Merck or any of the other companies, that's their job, to do the best they can for the profit and growth of their enterprise. In this system, they're playing by the rules. And those rules are do what's good for the company and don't worry about the costs if they're not costs for the company. If they are costs for the company, then of course you have to worry about them. But if they're not, if this system can be so arranged that the costs are borne by others, individuals, communities, and so on, then this is the route for us to do and to fight like crazy. So the drug companies were allowed in our system to pour huge amounts of money into the lobbying efforts to make sure that that health program did not disturb their interests. It got the insurance companies millions of new customers, forced, in a sign of a bizarre arrangement of how that would be necessary. I'll end with a story. 10 years ago, I was a visiting professor for a semester in Paris, at the University of Paris, number one, used to be called the Sorbonne. It's a beautiful old part of the university system. And because I was an employee, a footnote, France doesn't have private universities, because in France, the idea is if you have a private university and a public, that would be unfair and undemocratic, because the private one would be the one that the elite go to, and the public one would be for everybody else. So the only fair and democratic arrangement is that it's all public. I can see from your faces that at least some of you were not aware of this. That is the case in France. So inside the public, there can also be divisions for sure, but it's at least a thought. It's a thought that you don't allow that to be formalized in a private-public dichotomy. So in any case, as a visiting professor, I was then an employee of the French government, which paid my salary, and they put me immediately on the national health. And I got sick in the first semester and something with my throat, and I was told you should go get a strep throat test where they look down your throat and so forth. So I went to the clinic with my little card. And the first thing I noticed is nobody in the clinic except doctors. I expected clerks and secretaries and nurses and nothing. The doctor comes out, takes the card, sticks it in a machine, and there comes my medical history, all on the card. And the doctor looks at me, tells me I need to go down to the clinic down the way. I don't go to the clinic. There's nobody there except the technician who does the activities. No money changes hands, no record keep, nothing. That's why they save all the money. Everything is a kind of an automated system. It's just you and the medical professional dealing with you, and all the rest of this stuff is just gone. So it's no great mystery why it's so much cheaper to deliver quality health care to a mass of people, because they've arranged a system to do that. It is that the corporations here would want to keep a system that, by the way, the most profitable industry in this country is the medical care industry. So, I mean, you're talking about big corporations doing very well. That they would like to stay that way to keep that profitability is hardly surprising. That's how our system works. That the American people accept a system that costs them much more and delivers to them much less, and are in large numbers proud that they've retained it, that's the trick. And that's something we can do something about, because with information and explanation and some agitation in the population, people could have a different conception than the one that makes this an acceptable arrangement. If you were astonished when I explained to you that we bailed out the banks who used the money to make sure we wouldn't regulate them, then there's the same thing with the medical. Without the guarantees of the government and now this enforced enrollment and everything else, they would not be in a position to have the resources to keep a system going that is good for them, but dysfunctional for the mass of people, which is the basic argument.
Meanwhile, closing hospitals.
Closing hospitals, closing clinics. I live near St. Vincent's, and it's all boarded up. It's not very far from here, and you can see what the effects are. And there was a wonderful thing, I'll end with it. There was a wonderful bicycle chained to the St. Vincent's. It had a little sign on it that, this used to be a place where people could go when they were sick. The bicycle was there for months. It's gone now. And it's replaced by an immense American flag with a sign about how we should all remember 9/11. That's the United States. Rather than face the problems it has, it uses symbolism like patriotism and 9/11 to kind of hold on to a refusal to face the level of problem. But you can't do that anymore. The cost to this country of what this crisis is unleashing, it ought to make everyone significantly more open to asking the long-deferred questions about this system than they have been. And if my going around the country speaking is any sign, let me tell you, there's a lot we can do. The audiences are open for this on a scale that I have never seen in my life before. I can say what I say, and nobody tells me to go away in an unpleasant manner, and nobody refuses to listen. People they don't necessarily agree, but it's a changed America. It's not just the Tea Party. It's a lot of other people who've changed their ways of thinking, are asking questions, and are open to alternatives that they have not been before. But we've overstretched our allowance from the university that's provided the auditorium. Thank you very much again for coming.